Good morning and welcome to the Sunday morning sermon for Black Rock Baptist Church. We are in the midst of a sermon series entitled Canadian Idols. We're looking at idols that develop in our lives. The number 4 in the series, and I want to talk to you a little this morning about money changes everything. Luke chapter 19, the first 10 verses is our focus scripture for this morning. You know, one of my favorite Bible stories as a child was Zacchaeus. I knew it well because in Sunday school we would often sing that little chorus. So the words were, Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. He climbed up in a sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. And when the Savior came that way, he looked down from the tree and said, or he looked up into the tree and said, Zacchaeus, you come down here, because I'm going to your house for tea. Now, I suspect that one of the reasons I like that story, and many children still do today, is because it reflects Jesus' love for short people. And when you are a child and are often surrounded by grown-ups twice your size, it's nice to know the Lord cares about little people as well. Maybe some vertically challenged adults feel the same way. And yet the story of Zacchaeus contains a far more powerful message than that. Yes, God does indeed love short people and tall people and everyone in between, but this story also makes it clear that the Lord's love and grace extends even to those who worship the God known as money. Since money is one of the most popular of all the Canadian idols, and since there are people everywhere today who put money in the place in their lives where it doesn't belong, this indeed is very good news. Our text from Luke chapter 19 tells us the story of Zacchaeus. Let's be in prayer that God would speak to our hearts and our minds today and use his word to free us from the tendency that many of us have to love and trust and serve the God of money. Luke chapter 19, verses 1 and 2, it says, He, that being Jesus, entered Jericho and was passing through. There was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. Note, Luke does not say in any of these verses that he was short, because that is not the main point. Luke could have added that Zacchaeus was also very unpopular, because most people hated him. There are two reasons for that. The first is because he was rich. Now, in our day, there is certainly still some animosity toward people who have a lot of money. Some politicians suggest the solution to every problem is to tax the rich. And yet, the studies show that most North Americans admire folks who are wealthy. They recognize that many of these individuals have made their money through ingenuity and very hard work. Often our desire is not to bring the rich down, but to join them and become financially successful ourselves. In the first century, the attitude was different, though. Most folk didn't admire the rich. If someone had a lot of money, it was assumed that they had deprived or taken advantage of others. And in Zacchaeus' case, that was indeed true. Which brings us to the second reason why people didn't like him. They didn't like him because he was a tax collector. Now, working for Revenue Canada doesn't really make one very popular, I guess, but tax collectors were very much hated in the first century Israel. For one thing, they worked for the Romans, the occupying government. Though some people, including most Jewish leaders, had resigned themselves to Roman rule, no one thought it was a good thing. The idea that the Jewish people were under the authority of some pagan empire was repulsive to them. And the fact that anyone had to pay their hard earned money in taxes to an oppressive government caused much resentment. The thought that a Jew could take a job from the Romans to collect taxes did not sit well with most folk. And yet, this was only the tip of the iceberg. Tax collectors were in the habit in those days of collecting more taxes than Rome was actually assessing. Suppose there were 1,000 families in a particular region, and let's say the Romans wanted 10% of each family's income, a lower tax than we pay today. The tax collectors saw no reason to demand only 10%. Why not 15? Why not 20? Rather than prohibit this extortion, the Romans encouraged it. If you don't give the tax collector what he demands, you will be arrested. An annual income of a couple of $1 million in today's money was certainly possible for a tax collector. But it was income gained by stealing from his fellow Jews. People despise tax collectors. Even though they had a lot of money, on the social ladder, they were on the very bottom rung, right down there with drunks and prostitutes. In our culture today, a comparable profession would be that of a pimp or a drug dealer. No Jewish mother would ever say, "I'm so proud of my son. He's a tax collector." And Zacchaeus was the chief tax collector, which likely means he was the most hated in all the region. So why would someone choose a career or take a job that would result in almost everybody despising him? Why would someone want other people to hate him? I believe the answer is clear. The answer is money. Folks, the common wisdom is that what happens in life is determined not by how much money you have, but by how many good friends you have. Zacchaeus didn't buy into that idea at all. Who needs friends when you can have money to buy anything you want? I'd rather be eating prime cut of steak by myself than having hot dogs with my friends. Why did Zacchaeus think money was so important? Perhaps he'd grown up in poverty and developed this deep longing for something he didn't have. Or maybe the kids were always picking on him at school because of his short height. And out of bitterness, he decides, who needs friends? I'll show them by making a lot of money. For whatever reason, accumulating wealth became the top priority in Zacchaeus' life, and he fell in love with money. He was willing to do pretty much anything to build up and protect his bank account. Money was the most important thing in his life. In a sense, it had become his god, and in reality, he was nothing but a pagan idol worshiper bowing down before the god of mammon or money. Now, Zacchaeus was not the first and certainly not the last person to bow down to this false god of money. In recent centuries, it's become the most popular form of idolatry. It was Nietzsche who said, "What was once done for the love of God is now done for the love of money." I suspect money is likely near the top of all Canadian idols today. The term the Bible often uses to describe this type of idolatry is greed. Colossians chapter 3, verse 5, the Lord tells us through the Apostle Paul, put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. The idea of greed includes both a longing for money, wealth, and material things that you don't have, as well as a desire to protect and to keep what you do have. It's important to recognize one can be greedy without wanting to have very much. Greed involves both loving to have a lot and loving whatever it is you have a lot. People full of greed end up loving, trusting, and serving their money or their possessions instead of God. Tim Keller notes, lovers of money are those who find themselves daydreaming or fantasizing about new ways to make money, new possessions to buy, and looking with jealousy on those who have more than they do. Friend, do you ever find yourself doing any of those things? Or maybe singing, "If I Were a Rich Man." Yet the Bible warns us in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many sorrows. Trusting in money or possessions means thinking we will be safe, secure, and happy because of what we have. Again, we may have a great deal, or we might have not very much. But we are convinced that the things that we have or want to have are what is really important. Serving money and possessions is the most blatant and deadly dimension of this idolatry. Keller says, we sell our souls to our idols because we look to them for significance. We love them. And security, we trust them. We have to have them, and therefore we are driven to serve and essentially obey them. Friends, this is what Jesus speaks of in Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. No one can serve two masters, he says. For either you will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. This aspect of idolatry is evident in the choices that Zacchaeus has made. What do you want out of life, Zacchaeus? Well, I would like to make a lot of money and become very wealthy. That's what I want out of life. What are you willing to get that, Zacchaeus? Are you willing to betray your own people and have everyone hate you? And when Zacchaeus answers yes, it's pretty evident which God he is really serving. Now, it's important to realize that the sin of greed, which leads people to worship money, is a sin which is often easier to spot in someone else than within ourselves. Maybe some of you are already thinking, I'll have to have Joel listen to that sermon the pastor's preaching on YouTube this week because, he really has problems with greed. He really needs to hear that sermon, Pastor. Yet it's interesting that in Luke chapter 12, verse 15, Jesus says, watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. The implication is that greed is one of those subtle sins that can sneak up on us. It's very possible to be greedy, to worship money and possessions without realizing we're doing it. That can happen with folk who may have a lot, but love what they do have a lot as well. And it can happen when we look at other folks and say, well, I'm not really materialistic or greedy because the people I know have pretty much the same things I do. Buying a brand new Cadillac doesn't seem extravagant when your next door neighbor has two Mercedes sitting in his garage. I find it interesting that one survey found that only 2% of North Americans think of themselves as being upper class. Now, by definition, 20% of North Americans are really in that category. But it seems almost everyone wants to think of themselves as middle class or maybe upper middle class. The rich folk are always someone else. Friends, my guess is that the majority of us in this room make more money and possessions, make money and possessions a higher priority in life than we should. Some of us should be feeling real guilty since we really do love, trust, and serve the wealth that we have. But I never want you to leave this room on a Sunday morning just feeling guilty. Oh, that may happen sometimes, but my goal is that each one of us would experience God's love, God's grace in Jesus Christ in a fresh way as we hear and understand what he says in his word. So let's go back to Zacchaeus and see how he experienced the grace that Jesus offers. Chapter 19 of Luke's Gospel, verses 3 and 4, it says, "And he," that means Zacchaeus, "was seeking to see who Jesus was. But on account of the crowd, he could not, because he was small in stature." Or as the NLT says, he was too short to see over the crowd, so he ran ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was about to pass that way. Why didn't he just go and stand at the front of the crowd? So he could see better. Well, remember, nobody likes Zacchaeus. He would certainly be harassed and probably be pushed around. But he really does want to see Jesus. And even though climbing a tree with expensive robes on was not exactly the dignified thing for a grown man to do, that's what Zacchaeus does. In a culture where honor and dignity were very, very important, Zacchaeus swallows his pride. He becomes less prideful than he really has been at times, because he's desperate to see Jesus. Even though he has a lot of money, he's not very happy. He's starting to recognize that the pursuit of wealth is like drinking salt water. It really doesn't quench your thirst, and it actually makes him more thirsty. Verse 5 of chapter 19 says, "And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, 'Zacchaeus, hurry, come down, for I must stay at your house today.'" Note that this is not Zacchaeus that found Jesus, but rather it is Jesus who found Zacchaeus. Friends, that is true for all of us. Though you may think you were once seeking the Lord, I believe if you really think about it, you realize that the Lord was at work in your life, seeking you, long before you had any interest in him. Now, we might think Zacchaeus would be a little irritated that Jesus was basically inviting himself to dinner. But no, verse 6 says he hurried and came down and received him joyfully. This was the greatest day of Zacchaeus' life. Sure, Zacchaeus had everything that money could buy, but it had never made him happy. He realizes that Jesus is the one who can provide far more valuable things than anything else that he has, than all the money in the world can buy. He's very He's a very happy individual at this point. Okay, back to our text. When the crowd sees what's happening, sees Jesus is going home with Zacchaeus, verse 7 says they all grumbled. He's gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. That reflects how much these folk despise Zacchaeus. The fact good things, very good things, were happening in his life did not make most people happy at all. There are lessons in this for all of us that we need to maybe save for another time, but the important thing to understand for us right now is that God's grace, his magnificent forgiveness in Christ Jesus, extends to idolaters who love, trust, and serve money. That's the good news for many people. Having been forgiven for treating money as a god, having been freed from his idolatry of loving and trusting and serving money, Zacchaeus starts to think and act and treat others very differently. Verse 8 says, "Meanwhile Zacchaeus stood before the Lord and said, I will give half my wealth to the poor, Lord. And if I have cheated people on their taxes, I will give them back 4 times as much." Friends, there's no indication there that these were mere words. We have every reason to believe that this is exactly what Zacchaeus did. He became an extremely generous man. In the Old Testament law, the rule was that if you stole from someone, you had to make restitution with 20% interest. If you stole $100 from someone, you had to give them back $120. Zacchaeus decides that he will pay back 300% interest. If he had taken $100 from someone, he'll pay them back 400. And he was not going to give 10% to the poor. He would give half of what he had to the poor. Now remember, this would not necessarily make Zacchaeus a pauper. Let's say he had, I don't know, the equivalent of $20 million in the bank in today's money. He gives $10 million away, pays out $9 million in restitution. He's still got $1 million on which to live. However, he's now a very generous man. Note 2 things. Number 1, Zacchaeus generosity genuinely flows from Zacchaeus out of his experience of God's grace. He doesn't give away money to gain God's favor or to earn salvation. It's because he's already experienced God's favor and God's salvation that he becomes generous. In response to Zacchaeus' promise, Jesus says in verse 9, "Salvation has come to this home today, for this man has shown himself to be a true son of Abraham." Zacchaeus had always been a physical descendant of Abraham, but now he's a spiritual descendant. He is following in Abraham's footsteps by worshiping not money, but the true and living God. Friends, don't ever be confused. One cannot become a Christian by being generous with money. One is generous because he or she has become a Christian. Number 2, when we love and trust and serve God and not money, we have a new attitude toward money. It becomes much easier to give it away because it's no longer nearly as important as we thought it was. We also start to realize what we have doesn't really belong to us. It belongs to God, all of it. He has simply entrusted it to us to be used to honor Him and serve other people. Friends, in this world in which we live, there are some very generous individuals. That's true evidence of God's grace in their lives. Yet, to be frank, I don't find it easy to be generous. Do you? Oh, I give money to the church and to other causes and to people I see who are in need. I do give a bit more than the average Canadian, I think, but it's seldom easy. Often when I write the check, there's a thought in the back of my mind, hey, if I didn't give anything, or maybe if I only gave half this, I would have more money. And because I still tend to think money and things are more valuable than they really are, the thought of having more money tends to appeal. Charles Spurgeon used to say that the last part of a man to be baptized is his wallet. He was right. I've known many Christians, very godly attitudes about many things in life, but when it came to money, it was a whole different story. Friends, God expects us to be generous, very generous. Yet I have a feeling that as long as I am on this earth, I may not be totally free from the temptation to love, trust, and serve money and possessions. Friend, if you are in that boat as well, I encourage you to join me in praying that the Lord will help us to always realize and remember that in Jesus Christ we have everything we need or truly desire. That He alone is worthy of our love and our trust, and that we can't serve God and money. God bless. Have a wonderful day, and until we meet again, let's continue to exchange prayers daily.